Syria and the fall of Bashar Al Assad's dynasty has sent shockwaves across the Middle East and world as many days as he ruled for years. But that's just the beginning now, because as Syria begins to contend with its future and new political uncertainties, other countries are making their own moves. In one specific case, Israel, who has launched an unprecedented military campaign, raising questions about its relationship with Syria and what could happen next in this already incredibly unpredictable region of the world. So in this video, we explore what Israel is doing, why, and how it could play out considering everything else with Syria.
This is The Global Gambit.
How are you going? Welcome to today's video, where we deep dive into the seismic shifts in Syria following the dramatic collapse of the Assad regime. We take a specific angle in this case, Israel. In those astonishing events regarding the rebel forces led by Islamist group Hayat al-Sham's or HTS's overthrow of the Assad regime. This means a lot for Israel, given their unique circumstances in Lebanon, but also Gaza after October 7th. Now, Israel is conducting military actions aimed at neutralizing what they call strategic, quote, threats, having escalated the tensions to new heights in the eyes of some. So we have to take a step back and understand why Israel is doing what it's doing, but is also getting the reaction that it is. So let's set the stage there with a little bit of context. For over a decade, Assad's regime has ruled Syria with an iron fist, surviving that civil war which lasted over 13 years, thanks to support from key allies like Russia, Iran, and Hezbollah, all ones, particularly the last two, which have extremely antagonistic relations with Israel. Assad's regime collapsing seemed almost unthinkable until now, but now, since the HTS-led lightning offensive just a couple of weeks ago, seizing those key cities like Aleppo, Hama, and Homs, before taking Damascus, has led to a very different security architecture now for the Israelis. HTS, which was previously linked to Al-Qaeda, has declared Syria free while vowing to pursue war criminals from the Assad era. But at the same time, in the eyes of the Israelis, this is not enough, and that linkage to Al-Qaeda is still a significant concern for them. The Assad regime has also faced accusations of using chemical weapons, for example, during the civil war, a grim chapter that remains central to the legacy of the governance. This issue will be expanded a little bit more on because it plays into what specifically Israel was targeting in the past few days of airstrikes. Now, Israel's military operations are focused on the Golan Heights, a contested region annexed by Israel in 1981, but still internationally recognized as Syrian territory and has long been a focal point of contention between the two parties, as well as the region as a whole. It's crucial to keep in mind that despite the two countries' inception in the 20th century, neither have ever established formal diplomatic ties. So this elevated plateau not only provides a strategically military advantage in terms of the Golan Heights for Israel, but also in their eyes acts as a potential buffer zone, separating it from the instability of its neighbor. Israel's security concerns over this region are deeply rooted in decades of conflict and highlight the broader stakes of the current crisis across the region. The power vacuum has sent ripples across the region more broadly as well. Iran's influence in Syria has largely disappeared now, and Hezbollah, already largely decapacitated or incapacitated by the Israelis in its actions in Lebanon, as well as the developments in the Israeli-Gaza conflict, faces an uncertain future, meaning that they couldn't come to the defense of Assad. Meanwhile, Israel's actions suggest it's taking no chances with this political and physical landscape. Over the past few days, the IDF have conducted 300 to 400 airstrikes on Syrian targets, including ports in Latakia and Al-Baida, chemical facilities, and what remains of Syria's air force. In addition, strikes have reportedly targeted convoys, believing to be transporting advanced weaponry to remnants of Hezbollah still within the country. Israel has also intensified its focus on creating a more robust, specifically buffer zone along the northern border. The strategy involves ground operations in the demilitarized zone of Golan Heights, which does contain UN peacekeepers as well. And we have seen engagements between the IDF and UN peacekeepers in Lebanon, which is partially why it's raised more concerns about potential fallout. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu insists that these are only temporary defensive measures, but this is symbolism for some is unmistakable, that Israel is redefining its security in posture in a post-Assad Syria and taking advantage of the lack of governance there. By consolidating control over this critical region, Israel seeks to insulate itself from unpredictably from the unpredictably fractured and potentially completely failed Syrian state. Now, Israel and the Benjamin Netanyahu government's emphasis on insulation and preemptive self-defense is but one argument, and arguably agenda setting. But I would be curious to hear your thoughts on Israel's latest actions over Syria and the airstrikes it has conducted on the military, navy, and other areas within southwestern Syria. The stakes certainly couldn't be higher. For Israel, the potential for an extremist-led Syria presents an existential threat. Indeed, there are some analysts who worry Syria could become a breeding ground, similar to that of Afghanistan, for Islamic jihadism. But its strikes, therefore, are not just about immediate security, but also shaping the long-term balance of power in the region. A key concern is Syria's history with chemical weapons, which were used at last 34 times during the civil war between 2013 and 18, according to UN and the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, or OPCW. Despite Syria's 23 accession to the Chemical Weapons Convention and its declaration to destroy 1,300 tons of BAM munitions, weapons inspectors have found evidence of ongoing programs obstructed by Assad's regime. Israel's officials fear that these BAM munitions could fall into the hands of non-state actors, or in the case, extremist groups like they still see HDS, further destabilizing the region, but more specifically their own security. For Syria, the post-Assad regime begins under the shadow of international scrutiny and domestic uncertainty. HDS's leadership now must prove its ability to govern, avoiding further violence and stabilizing the nation very quickly, which it is attempting to do, at least in the initial early days, but may well be made harder by continued foreign interference. There is, of course, the broader scale, which is lingering in the background. Iran's diminished role or inability to leverage its strategic deterrence and proxy system anymore. With the loss of Hezbollah and other militias, Israel has been much freer to conduct itself in its near abroad against Hezbollah, even the Houthis, without Iran really able to do very much. And then there's, of course, Turkey, with its ambiguous relationship to some of the rebel groups in the north, but also its difficult relationship, complex relationship with the Israelis, where Erdogan has been very critical, openly critical of the actions in Gaza, but now may well these two have to find a new way to get along, or to at least not get in each other's way, a bit like the United States managed with Russia during the two's attempt to both deal with ISIS, but at the same time support their respective sides in the Syrian civil war. Could we see Turkey and Israel putting aside their differences on the humanitarian front for the sake of strategic and self-interests? All these different questions and perspectives does lead me to the emphasis that I want to make of how people may see the Israeli situation. Of course, the main argument on one hand is that Israel is defending itself. From the government and people's standpoint, their airstrikes and military operations are essentially defensive measures. Israel has long maintained that it can't afford any hostile and unstable Syria, as given all the other fronts it has to contend with. By targeting those chemical weapon facilities, weapon convoys, military infrastructures, and so on, Israel claims it is protecting its sovereignty and protecting these threats from reaching its territory. Israeli warplanes have conducted numerous sorties against such, quote, strategic weapons since the rebel offensive in Syria just a few days ago. But now it's beginning to get to the point where people argue this is going too far. Benjamin Netanyahu has made it clear that they do not want any such capabilities to, quote, fall into the wrong hands. And the events over the Golan Heights is, quote, only a temporary defensive position until a suitable arrangement is found. And the idea that maybe a critical buffer zone is created. Who exactly would manage that is, though, again, the question, and whether or not the Israelis would believe or trust in a United Nations mission to do that, given their relationship to, say, UNRWA in Palestine. On the other hand, people who are critical of Israel's actions argue that they are going far beyond that of self-defense and portraying themselves as more an aggressor and even potential occupier further into Syrian territory. Since the annexation over 40 years ago, this has been a prevailing narrative around people who are heavily critical of Israel's actions in Gaza and Lebanon as well. The intensification of the military operations, particularly in Syria now, remains outside what Israel's internationally recognized borders are, and therefore no longer necessary in terms of military conduct. Netanyahu's statement that the Golan Heights would remain, quote, a part of Israel for eternity, and the suggestion by Benny Gantz, leader of the National Unity Party, to forge new alliances with groups traditionally opposed to Assad's government, further fuels that this is not merely a temporary defensive position. and that Israel's reactions have exploited, quote, the vacuum in Syria in order to occupy more Syrian land and impose new facts on the ground in contravention of international law. This is my attempt to provide an overview of the two narratives, and as well as many other points in this very complex and sensitive situation. So what is next? Well, I think it largely depends on what happens within Syria. If HTS and the coalition can continue to build on what looks like, again, encouraging development so far, and bring more reassurance to their immediate surrounding neighbours, but also the broader international community, then you may well begin to see Israel draw down some of its military activities with the hope that it can form some kind of relations. The Trump administration of the US will be very important in this regard because he will be wanting to leverage Israel as one of his primary methods to engage Iran, one of his main foreign policy objectives, which is maximum pressure against the Islamic Republic. On the international stage, though, it's going to be more complicated for Israel, given its continued operations in now over 3 countries, arguably 4 if you include Yemen and the Houthis, and how it engages with regional players like Turkey, particularly as it has its NATO membership role. But if Trump is able to bring some kind of engagement between Syria and Israel, you may well even see a creation of ties between those two. Ultimately, things are moving at a rapid pace at the end of Assad's 5-decade rule, and how we've seen a shift from a completely authoritative state to one which is being governed by multiple entities at this point, and trying to create a clear pathway of political transition. Will this be a story of reconstruction and reconciliation, or one of continued conflict? Only time will tell. But if you found this video insightful, then don't forget to like it, share, and subscribe for more in-depth analysis on global events. Again, what are your thoughts on Israel's actions in Syria? What are your thoughts on the situation in Syria as a whole? Drop a comment below, and don't forget to ring the bell to always know when these videos go live. And as we like to say on the Global Gambit, you've either got to get playing or be played. Take care, everyone.